Now, given that most action-centric video games will hurl at least a handful of boss fights at the player, it simply isn't possible for all of them to be incredible home runs. But even so, it's always disheartening when a boss fight lacks the imagination and creativity of the game's other encounters, and it's clear that the developers simply shoved it in as padding or didn't have the time necessary to make it interesting. Bad boss fights can derail a game's momentum at a crucial moment, though it's also fair to say that sometimes even a truly awful battle can be rescued from the doldrums by an unexpected fleck of brilliance. And that's what we're here to talk about today. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 exact moments that saved terrible video game bosses. Number 10. Wrecking Wesker with a rocket launcher. Resident Evil 5. As fun as the idea of battling Albert Wesker inside of an active volcano sounds, Resident Evil 5's final boss is ultimately a frustrating slog, a boulder-punching insanity aside. There are a few things that render the final clash intensely annoying. If you're low on ammo, you're basically screwed. Shooting Wesker's small weak spot is a chore, the QTEs are exhausting, and co-op players are put at a significant disadvantage by some hellacious button-mashing requirements. Yet your perseverance is rewarded with a final outcome that is most certainly worth all of those deaths and restarts. After finally defeating Wesker, a cutscene will see Chris and Sheva rescued via helicopter by Jill and Stone, but a lava-soaked Wesker will make one final stand, trying to pull the helicopter into the lava. Until that is, Chris and Sheva both grab tandem rocket launchers and fire them at his mug. In glorious slow motion, we get to see the rockets hit Wesker right in the face, exploding him into meaty, magma-y chunks. While the boss fight itself was more irritating than fun, at least it gave us a definitive ending for Wesker worthy of his status as this series' all-timer antagonist, chowing down on 2 rockets whilst being on fire. Number 9. Cheesing the final boss. Just Cause 3. Now, Resident Evil 5 sure doesn't hold a monopoly on naff final boss fights set in active volcanoes involving helicopters, as Just Cause 3 proves. The game's final boss fight is against the tyrannical dictator of the area, and if you play it the proper way, it amounts to 10 soul-grindingly tedious minutes of firing away at his helicopter until his life bar is whittled down to 0. Despite how amusingly cartoonish it sounds on paper, it's a bog-standard boss fight that feels dreadfully boring, but you can make it considerably more fun by cutting through the middle entirely and finishing the battle in record time. As it turns out, you can skip the bullet-spongy fight altogether by just tethering the chopper to a rock and using your grappling hook, causing the bird to immediately careen out of the sky and explode. Now, if you play it the normal way, it's a dreadfully generic, forgettable boss fight, but if you get smart about it, you'll likely never forget the euphoric rush of seeing the big bad of the area annihilated in mere seconds. Number 8. Senator Armstrong loves nanomachines. Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. Though Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance's bosses largely can't hold a candle to the ingenious boss fights in the mainline entries, one of them nevertheless proves how a single line can elevate an otherwise frustrating and infuriating final boss. Revengeance concludes with you taking on the hilariously buff politician Senator Armstrong in a half-hour slog of a fight that is deeply challenging due to both the strength of Armstrong's attacks and his huge defensive capabilities. Your windows to deal major damage are maddeningly short, and unless you've mastered the game's dodge and parry mechanics, you're likely going to find yourself thoroughly bodied by this guy. And yet, as inconceivable as it seems, there's a single moment in this fight that somehow makes all of this okay. Roughly halfway through the fight, you frustratedly ask Armstrong, "Why won't you die?" prompting Armstrong to rip his shirt off and reveal his nanomachine upgrades, before delivering the now mic drop quip, "Nanomachines, son." For anyone who was losing their mind, or indeed will to live with this fight at this point, it was a perfectly placed moment of punctuating comic relief, giving players the resolve to keep pushing forward. Almost a decade later, Armstrong's iconic, perhaps infamous quip endures as a Hall of Fame gaming meme. Without it, it would be so much easier to dismiss this fight as a textbook example of throw everything at the player cheapness. Number 7. Ogre becomes True Ogre. Tekken 3. Tekken 3's arcade mode concludes with a battle against the god of fighting known as Ogre, and as anyone who's played the game will appreciate, he is a major pain in the arse. Ogre's attacks will inflict massive amounts of damage, enough that he can rinse your entire life bar in just a few well-placed hits. It is, as a result, an extremely frustrating fight, and even if you're lucky enough to down him the first time around, you'll probably tremble with fear at the thought of fighting his grotesque final form True Ogre in the second. Yet you can wipe those tears away and let out a big sigh of relief, as though True Ogre is seen absorbing the power of Heihachi's unconscious body between rounds. The second round is actually so much easier. True Ogre's towering stature simply makes him a clunkier and clumsier opponent, meaning that he telegraphs all of his attacks more openly and can be attacked more easily. As such, compared to his first form, you likely won't have too much trouble defeating True Ogre, a decision on the part of Namco that probably prevented thousands of PS1 controllers from getting snapped over teenagers' knees.
Hello and welcome to the hardest gaming themes quiz ever.
Oh man.
Josh.
Fortnite.
Oh, Sly Raccoon.
Blurry.
Sonic Hedgehog.
Johnston.
Oh,
Tetris.
oh.
Number 6. EIDOS patches the bosses. Deus Ex Human Revolution. Though Deus Ex Human Revolution doesn't feature many bosses, they were all pretty damn wretched, let's just be honest here. In the game's original release, the central boss fights forced players to engage with the enemies in a direct and lethal manner, but given the series' historic focus on hacking and stealth, this both ran counter to its established identity and left players who hadn't invested much in combat up creek without a paddle. Affected players were basically forced to cheese their way through these fights, but a little over 2 years later, EIDOS finally offered up a solution. With the release of the game's director's cut, which admittedly players had to pay to upgrade to, the boss encounters were all reworked to offer more nimble, stealth-based solutions, such as hacking turrets to do the heavy lifting or releasing poison gas to incapacitate them. While the boss battle still feels somewhat out of place given the lack of non-lethal options on offer, the patch certainly made them considerably more tolerable, and more of a slight smudge on the game rather than a dark, indelible mark. Number 5. Ripping Helios' head off, God of War 3. Relatively early on in God of War 3, you'll do battle against the god Helios. Though compared to the game's bevy of challenging and testosterone-fueled battles, it's pretty weak sauce. Less a conventional boss battle than an interactive series of cinematic beats, you'll grab a hold of Helios whilst he takes flight, and then spend a good while taking down other enemies and solving puzzles whilst he attempts to flee. Even when you do catch up to him, you're forced to rinse a fleet of his minions whilst a wounded Helios just hangs around in the corner in a pool of his own blood. But once you finally turn your attention to Helios alone, he attempts to blind you with his sunbeam, forcing you to block the path forward with your hand until you reach him, and that's basically the boss fight. The appeal of a high-octane, high-wire battle against Helios speaks for itself, and so it feels like quite the missed opportunity. But the fight at least ends in a fashion more typical of God of War, as Kratos stomps Helios' head into the ground numerous times before grabbing his noggin and ripping it clean off. This being the pre-tasteful God of War era, we get to watch in graphic detail as Helios' head is parted from his shoulders, and it is so wonderfully, nauseatingly brutal. But being who he is, Helios remains alive as a decapitated head, which Kratos then uses as a lantern. Number 4. CHYKKA'S adult form, Metroid Prime 2 Echoes. Now we're possibly courting controversy here, but when we say that Metroid Prime 2's Chica or Chika is a terrible boss, we're only really talking about the first 30% or so of the fight. In Torva's Bog, you'll eventually come across this beast, which in its first form is a lava that swims about the arena whilst sicking its minions on you and occasionally emerging out of the water for you to take a shot and slowly whittle its life bar down. It's basically generico boss design 101 and seems totally naff, and an unimaginative boss battle for the creative standards of the game otherwise. But once you get Chika or Chika's larval form down to nil and it disappears back into the watery depths, the boss fight really starts. At this point, it re-emerges as a metamorphosed adult, which can move considerably faster and deal far more damage, all while the player has to deal with the altered geometry of the arena, which shifts when the adult resurfaces. It's a long and challenging fight, but never feels cheap, while boasting the ingenuity and intensity that the larval stage was so sorely lacking in. Number 3. GONARCH gets a remake facelift, Half-Life Black Mesa. In the original version of Half-Life, GONARCH's lair is an incredibly short chapter lasting a mere number of minutes, in which whilst Gordon Freeman explores the alien world of Zen, he crosses paths with the giant spider-like creature known as the GONARCH. Battling the GONARCH simply involves repeatedly inflicting enough damage upon it that it flees through the various areas of the lair until it eventually dies and leaves a portal for Gordon to go through. In the original game, the GONARCH was a relatively bland and generic monster baddie for the player to defeat, but in the third-party remake Black Mesa, well, it becomes an epic and seriously challenging foe. In Black Mesa, the GONARCH's lair chapter was given significant expansion, running around 30 minutes instead of 5. With the GONARCH appearing numerous times throughout. Now crucially, here it's presented in a far more intense and terrifying way. Its attacks and charges are considerably more aggressive, resulting in a much more difficult fight. As with this chapter as a whole, the reworked boss fight just bleeds atmosphere that feels comparatively lacking in the original, aided in no small part by a truly kick-ass new soundtrack. Given that this entire area felt rather rushed in the original release, Black Mesa's greatest triumph might be doing more fleshed out justice to it, and making the GONARCH feel like a less generic monster and a more genuinely fearsome enemy. Number 2. Insulting Kai Leng as you kill him. Mass Effect 3. Mass Effect 3's worst boss fight is surely the second encounter with the elusive man's insufferable lackey Kai Leng. A Cerberus assassin whose design and edgelord attitude both suggest that he tripped and fell into Mass Effect out of another franchise entirely, say like he came from Metal Gear. As for the fight itself, it takes place inside the elusive man's office, and as much as we're all looking forward to giving Leng a biblical ass-kicking, it's ultimately more of a slog than a fun time. Between Leng's incredible speed and defensive abilities, namely his regenerating shields, it's a chore of a fight that can take an unprepared player a long damn time, but the graft is ultimately worth the outcome, given how satisfying Leng is ultimately 86th. Once you finally whittle Leng's health down to a nub, a cutscene will show him making one final attempt to kill you, and whether you go Renegade or Paragon, the outcome is more or less the same, skirting Leng's attacks and fatally stabbing him with your own Omniblade. If you go Renegade, as you absolutely should in this instance, you'll get the added badassery of breaking Leng's sword with your fist before running him through, rather than simply dodging it as a Paragon. Either way, the greatest moment is saved for last, when Shepard tells an impaled Leng, "This is for the Atlanta Falcons, you son of a bitch," with the gap being filled by whichever of your characters he killed early on. And number 1, shoving Big Smile Lee into the ice chipper. Sleeping Dogs. There's not a massive amount of variety between the boss encounters in Sleeping Dogs, enough that you probably couldn't be blamed for really feeling totally over them all by the time you confront the game's big bad, Big Smile Lee. And for the most part, it's about as formulaic and unimaginative as a concluding clash as you probably expect from a Grand Theft Auto clone, admittedly not a bad one, as you fight your way through Lee's never-ending fleet of bodyguards, chase him down, and then engage him in hand-to-hand combat. The fair clunkiness of this combat makes it hard not to groan when the final fisticuffs begin, but developers United Front Games ultimately grant players some mercy by cutting the final punch-up short after just a minute or two. So, a pretty underwhelming boss fight, right? Well, not quite, because once you've punched Lee's face into a fine paste, you're then instructed to dump him into the nearby ice chipper, which promptly mashes his body up with a level of violence typically reserved for a bloody saw trap. And just like that, a dreadfully dull, boring final boss fight becomes awesome courtesy of an all-timer coup de grace. And there we go, my friends. Those were 10 exact moments that saved terrible video game bosses. I hope that you enjoyed that, and please let me know what you thought about it down in the comments section below. As always, I've been Jules. You can go follow me over on Instagram, where it's RetroJ, but the O is a 0, and I hope to see you over there. But before I go, I just want to say one thing. I hope you're treating yourself well with love and respect, my friend, because you deserve all of the best things in life, alright? And don't let anything or anyone else tell you otherwise. You're a massive ledge. Now go out there and smash it today. As always, I've been Jules. You have been awesome. Never forget that, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.